Hello from Intellipaat guys. Today we're going to be building a React.JS project, but before we begin, be sure to hit that subscribe button and click on that bell notification icon so you don't miss out on any updates from us. So firstly, we're going to be going over what JavaScript is, then we will discuss what React.js is because we need to know a little bit of JavaScript before we begin with React.js. Then we're going to be going over the advantages of React.js in today's world, and then we're going to be understanding the prerequisites before beginning a React.js learning career or learning path for React.js, what knowledge base you need to have for that, and then we're going to be going over some use cases for React.js, where it is being used today, and finally, we're going to be building our React.js chat application. Now, let's go over what JavaScript is. JavaScript is a high-level, often just-in-time compiled programming language and multi-paradigm. A just-in-time compiled programming language means that the code is compiled upon runtime, as in upon execution. So that sort of leads up to the dynamic element that JavaScript provides to today's tech environment, the web application environment, as in it provides us with an interactive experience on the code. JavaScript enables interactive web pages and is an essential part of web applications. So the vast majority of web browsers that we have today, like Google Chrome, Mozilla Firefox, Opera, they all have a dedicated JavaScript engine built inside of them simply to execute this JavaScript code. Earlier, we used to have these statically rendered HTML web pages, and today we have something like JavaScript, which changes on the go upon user interaction or server interaction. So basically, that is why we use JavaScript today, to provide us with some sort of dynamic element to our web applications. So we essentially have two categories of JavaScript libraries and frameworks. First is the front-end JavaScript, and the second is the back-end JavaScript, which we also call as server-side script. So the server-side script includes frameworks and libraries like Node.js and Meteor.js and Express.js, which are essentially the building blocks for the server-side deployment, server-side coding functionalities of whatever website or web application that you're building. The front-end JavaScript includes frameworks and libraries like Vue.js, React.js, and AngularJS. So all of these things constitute for what the client sees on his end when he is interacting with the website. So as we can see here, we have the old web app architecture, which has the web browser, the client-side web browser, performing no calculations at all, only rendering the HTML static page that the server is sending to the client, while the server side performed all of the calculations, whether they were heavy calculations or minor calculations, and gave the client side the final view that the client could see on his end. So the new web architecture changes this in a drastic way. So with JavaScript, you can now perform calculations, these minor calculations on your end as well. So the server has a lower overhead because it does not have to do meager calculations. Because say if a million clients are trying to access your website and the server is basically rendering and calculating all of this information for the clients simultaneously, that takes a lot of toll on the server. So in the new web app architecture, JavaScript enables the client to calculate a lot of things on their end as well. So this is how the server overhead is reduced, and the server performs only the most essential calculations that is required of the server, while the client entirely deals with this with the website rendering and the minor calculations essentially. So we'll be going over how that works. So the primary selling point of JavaScript is that it's fundamentally a client-side language, which means things happen dynamically, they dynamically change on the client side. The latency for the front-end JavaScript is zero, because if you're a client and you're trying to access a website and the website is already loaded onto your computer and you're basically performing the calculation, JavaScript is essentially executing on your end. The latency becomes zero because you're not contacting the server, you're not requesting the server with anything. You've initially requested the server for the website. Once the server has given the website to you, you're performing these smaller calculations on your end. Like on the right hand here, we have a stack implementation where an element is being pushed onto a stack. So this is being done on the client side. As you can see, it's within an HTML enclosure. This is a JavaScript code within an HTML enclosure, and all of this calculation is being done on the client side. So the server is essentially free from this load, and the server can focus on its other tasks like fetching data from databases and performing heavier calculations. So what is React.JS? So now that we've discussed what front-end JavaScript is, we will now be heading over to React.JS. So React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So whenever you have websites which rely heavily on user interfaces with elements that require a lot of user interaction, React.js is the go-to language for you in the front end. So this is a library that is being maintained by Facebook and the community. So updates are very frequent, and it's one of the most popular front-end libraries as well. So if you are trying to develop a single web page based website or a web application or a mobile application for that case, you can use React for that. It's pretty convenient. So is React an MVC framework? So MVC stands for Model View Controller. So we'll be going over what Model View Controller is. So let's start over with view. As you can see on the left hand side, we have a diagram, so it's clearer for you. The view is what the user sees when they first log into the website. So when they see the view, they basically interact with elements present in that view. When you open a Facebook page, you have this login button, you have a create your account button. So that is the view that you get from Facebook when you log into Facebook initially. Not log into, just access the website. Then you enter your email and your password, and that implies that you're using that view. So when the user, you use that view, that information is conveyed by the controller to the model. The model stands for the server side end of things. The model processes this information that you've sent it, and it says that you are authenticated as a user, and then it updates your view as you're authenticated now. Like the controller manipulates that information, the model processes that information, and the model gives you this new view in which you are in your Facebook homepage. So that is essentially how the MVC framework works. So React.js is not an MVC framework because it only deals with the view aspect of things. It does not deal with the controller or model aspect of things. So it is purely and strictly a front-end library, and it is not implementing any of the server side or model implementations. So in short, no, React.js on its own only makes up for the view part of the MVC architecture. ReactJS syntax. So this is a sample code of React.js. As you can see, the ID is my React app, and we're essentially using JavaScript code within HTML's construct. As we can see in the return statement that we have an h1 enclosure in which we are essentially opening a curly bracket and writing props.greeting, and this is JavaScript code. So whenever you use curly brackets inside HTML code within React, it's JavaScript code. So props.greeting is essentially implementing an argument that has been sent to this function, this React.js function, and you're printing that while using return h1. The return h1 goes to the index.js that you have, and the index.js renders it onto the HTML that the client sees on their end. So as we can see on the bottom line, we have React DOM.render app document.get element by my React app. So it will get this particular element, and it will return whatever the props.greeting variable contains. So in this case, the greeting is equals to hello world. So in our case, in this particular example, props.greeting would return the h1 of hello world, and it would be rendered upon the HTML of the app that we are trying to develop. That is how the React.js syntax is. Just to give you an idea of it, we will be getting into it further when we implement our project. So advantages of React.js. First advantage is the usage of virtual DOMs instead of real DOMs. So DOM stands for document object models. These are essentially trees which represent the hierarchy of every element that is present within the web page. So instead of changing all of these elements, the actual DOM tree that we have, the usage of virtual DOMs implemented by React.JS creates a virtual environment for these elements to change wherever there is a minimalistic change that has to be reflected upon the web page. So when we are using virtual DOMs, this means that we are not actually interacting with the server. We are only doing this on the client's end itself. So we're virtualizing the DOM structure on the client's end, and we're changing all of these elements on the client's end only. So the server is not involved, and the real DOM trees aren't affected by this. So the server doesn't have to return any information back after we interact with the website. So that is how virtual DOM helps us to achieve an efficient website architecture. Then we have reusability of code. So JavaScript is used for dynamic changing in the web page, and React.js is used when there are a lot of elements involved in your web page. So say that you want to use a particular type of button again. So you can just simply use that module of code which you've created for the button and use it as many times as you want inside your code. So that implements reusability of code in React.js. So everything is a component in React.js, and you can use these components as many times as you want. So that is why React.js has ease of reusability of code. And we have Babel. Babel is a JavaScript compiler that is mainly used to convert ECMAScript code into a backwards compatible version of JavaScript in current or older versions of the JavaScript environment. So whatever the version of your JavaScript is, Babel converts it into a readable version of JavaScript and for the particular website that the client is trying to access your website from. So that is why Babel is used to convert your newer or possibly newer version of JavaScript into a readable version of JavaScript by anybody's web browser. And now JSX, the use of JSX. So JSX is an XML, HTML-like syntax. So as we saw before in the example that we had for our ReactJS syntax, we saw an HTML-like code. So that wasn't actually HTML, it was JSX. This JSX is processed by the transpiler we call Babel into actual HTML when we see it on our websites. But when we're using React.js and we're trying to implement HTML-like functionalities, HTML-like renders, we are actually using JSX. There is a slight change in the syntax of JSX from HTML, but not by much. So JSX essentially allows us to embed actual JavaScript code within an HTML element or an JSX element. So we can, that props.greetings that we have the ability to add JavaScript code within actual HTML-like code. So that is why JSX is used. That is the advantage of JSX, and that is the advantage of JSX in React.js. So we'll quickly go over the prerequisites for this course. If you're starting out with React.js, you need to have sound knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to understand how some of these things are working. Although you don't need to know CSS in particular detail because CSS is just a styling element, but it's good to know because if you're going to be developing front-end, if front-end is your ultimate focus, if you're not transitioning towards a more full-stack environment, then it's important for you as a front-end engineer to understand CSS really well. And JavaScript and HTML are musts if you're trying to start with React.js. So we'll quickly go over some use cases for React.js as well. So the first use case is web apps that contain elements that facilitate heavy user interaction. So elements that are essentially giving the user a lot of options to interact with them, which have to change dynamically on the go. So those sort of web applications. Then we have if the state of the component changes a lot. So if you have things like dark mode in your website, and buttons that change upon interaction. So all of these things, the state of those things, those components change a lot. Then also the React.js is quite a beneficial language for you. Then we have complex website structures that require a lot of organization for easy maintenance and updates. So after you've built your web application, if you want to maintain it easily, if you want to upgrade it easily, you can use React.js for it, because you're essentially building a lot of components, and if you want to limit your update or maintenance to a particular component, you can do that very easily because of the organized structure that React.js provides to you. Then we have applications where a lot of elements can be reused or repurposed. So as we discussed before, if you have elements that have to be used again and again in your website at various points, you can use React.js, because once you create a component, you can use it as many times as you want. Here are some organizations that use React.js. We have Airbnb, Pinterest, Facebook, obviously, and Twitter and Instagram, because these are owned by Facebook. So it only makes sense for them to have React.js as their front end. Then we also have Netflix and Reddit. So there's a lot of scope for React.js as well, because a lot of websites today use React.js. And a lot of websites also use Angular, but that's kind of a debatable topic as to what is better. I would say there are pros and cons to each of them. For now, we will just focus on React.js. So now that we are done with the introduction, let's just understand a little bit of the React router, because we're going to be using it in our project today. React router helps us to set paths in the folder structure of our web application. So say you want to redirect yourselves towards a newer component, towards some different component, you can set that path inside your browser router element that we have here. Like as you can see in our syntax, we are declaring 3 paths, and we are essentially redirecting our client towards those paths upon a particular activity. Then we have socket.io. So socket.io is an external element that is pretty easy to use. It's a JavaScript library for real-time web applications. It enables real-time bidirectional communication between web clients and servers. So instead of the server constantly listening to your instructions, we can simply create a socket.io pipeline between the server and the client. And then as long as the pipeline has been created, then the server can listen to the client and interact particularly to it, because the server always listening is a pretty bad idea when it comes to the processing power that requires and the inefficiency in total allocated to it. So that is why we use this JavaScript library we call socket.io. As you can see, we are creating a connection in our syntax that we have over here. In the variable io, we are requiring the socket.io, and we are creating a new connection whenever a user is connected. So now with all of that done, let us begin with the project. So before beginning with this tutorial, I would recommend you to install Node.js, because that is quite essential to this project for the backend. So once you've opened up your favorite IDE, in my case, I've opened up VS Code because it provides with a terminal. So simply create your project folder. I'm calling my project ReactJS chat. Once I've created it, I've opened it up using open folder on the file option over here. So simply open it up and then open up the terminal. So once you've opened up the terminal, we'll create 2 React apps for the client side and the server side. So 2 React apps in total. We'll type npx create React app client. So now an application, a folder structure with client will create inside of the React.js chat a directory. So we'll wait up for that. So once you've done that, once you click on refresh over here, you'll find your client folder created. We'll simply do the same for the server. So we'll bring up the statement again and write server, press enter. So this will take another bit of time for the server to initialize. So once you've created the server, simply open up the server from your browsing directory and open up the src folder. Remove whatever there is inside the src folder, like I have removed it beforehand, and then simply create new files. The first file that we would create is the index.js. Create that. The second file that we would create is users.js, which would be storing the template form of our users for our backend structure. And then finally, we would create the routing table, the routing.js file. So once we've created all of these 3 JavaScript files, we'll simply start coding with the users.js first. So inside the users.js file, we'll create certain functions to implement a functionality where inside a chat room, we are adding users, removing users, checking if a user with the same name already exists. So for all of those functionalities, we'll first need to create this users.js JavaScript file. So we'll create an array called users. Then we'll create a function for adding a user. So all of these are the parameters for that: ID, name, and role. whatever the prompt, whatever this request to the server is. So there will be an ID associated to that user, there will be a name, and there will be a room. This ID would be the socket ID. So we're also standardizing the name as well before we convert it to lowercase, so that if the user has entered their name in capital lettering, or if there are trailing spaces in the string of the input, we are simply trimming it up so that we get the same string again. Once we've done that, we will now check if the user exists in the room, and if that user exists in the room, we will not add that user, but if that user does not, we will add them. So this is a function for that. We'll first check if the room will first match the room, and for that particular room only we will check if the name exists or not, because if the user that is trying to access a chat room is not accessing the chat room where that name already exists, if that user is accessing another chat room, that shouldn't lead to the server rejecting that user's request. So for that we will first check if the rooms are same. So in that room we will check if the user exists. So the function template has been created. We'll now simply implement the logic for that. So firstly, when the user inputs, the client inputs their credentials, we need to be sure that they have entered both the credentials. So for that we are giving an error message if they haven't entered both of the credentials. If not name or not room, even if one of those credentials are lacking, we'll simply throw an error message, username and room are required. And if the function, we will first check if the user is existing. So in that case we'll throw an error where we'll say that the username is already taken. For this particular room. Once we've done that, create the array structure for the user, store it inside this constant user variable, and then we'll simply push it onto the pre-existing users array we have for that particular room. So we're now done with the add user function that we have. Once we're done with that, simply create a function for removing a user. For this we only need the ID, because the other details we have already input. So once the user disconnects their socket, we'll simply need the ID for that, and we'll correlate it with all of the other variables that we have, and we'll remove that from the array as well. So firstly, let's create the function for that. The parameter is only ID. So we'll first run a search operation, find the index of that particular user, and we'll match if the ID matches the user ID present in that array for us to remove this user from our array. Once we've done that, simply create a function where we are splicing that user of this array that we already have. So basically index 1, 0 would return that user from inside of the user's array, and we're simply splicing it off from that particular array whenever we find it on that index number. So once we've done that, we can move on to creating a function get user to implement all our other functions from the different JS modules that we have. Simply use it as a tool later on. The parameter for this would be ID, and simply run it as a search sort of functionality whenever any of the server modules need to find a particular user by their ID. users.find user. So we'll check all over the array for that particular ID. Once it finds it, it'll check if the ID matches the user ID. That is what this function will check. We'll close that up too. We'll also create a function if we ever need it to get all of the users present inside a room. Call this the parameter that we would take for this is room, and simply run a filter on the array and put in as the criteria for that particular array to have that room in its parameters in the mapped values that user's array has. So simply type user.room triple equals. So wherever the room is the same, we will return all of the users present inside that particular room in the user's array. So once we've created all of these functions, we can implement all our other backend functionalities pretty well. So we'll simply export this by using module.exports and all of these function names. So if you want to return multiple functions from a particular JavaScript file, you can use module.exports when you're using React. Simply type all of the functions that we've created just now. And we'll close this up with a semicolon. So that is about it for the users.js file. We'll simply save this. So once we are done with indexed users.js, we can open up routers.js. This will essentially tell us if the server is running or not, and it will update like every 300 seconds or something like that. So we'll just add a status bar to it so that it updates every set amount of time to tell us if the server is running or not. So we'll simply import Express for this because we're using some Express functionalities. Right, require Express, and then we would be requiring the router that Express has. So we'll simply type Express router. So we're storing that inside the constant router. So we'll simply type router.get request and response. Request response.send whenever it's prompted for this particular response, if the server is running or not. Simply type response would be server is running successfully, and simply type in what status. So that would be about it for the router.js. We'll simply export this module. So finally on to the index.js. Here is where we'll be using our socket.io and HTTP protocols for the primary implementation of the server. So firstly we'll create a constant variable HTTP, and we'll get the HTTP protocol by using require. Use this up. We get the express, because we need express for this. We need socket.io, simply write require socket.io. So some of these dependencies we'll also have to build once we're progressing with the project, and we need cores as well. So simply write cores. Now we will be importing our functions that we just created in users.js. So we'll simply write const and all of the function names that we used, add user, get user, and get users. And once we created all of that, simply write require and the location of our users file, which would be in the same directory as the index.js file. We write that and close this up. We have to put this in single quotes just a moment. So once you put it in single quotes, that would redirect to that particular location whenever those functions have to be imported. We also require the router because we would need it for displaying our server status. That is why we use the dot status in front of router, and we'll close this up. We'll use const app and get the express module inside this variable. Server has to be created on HTTP, so we'll use the HTTP module for that. HTTP create server, one of the functions attached to that module, and this up. And the input output variable would be mapped to the socket IO, and the socket IO will use the server that we created using the HTTP module, which simply given the variable for that, which is server. Once we've done that, we'll associate this app that we've created with the express module and associate it to course. Now, if you're dealing with express connectivity middleware, you'll use course for that. So we're using with the connectivity right here. So we're using course, and we'll use router. So upon connection request, we'll turn on the socket. So we'll type in io.on. io is the variable associated to the socket module, and function name would be connect. When the function name is connect, we'll simply declare that function's purpose, typing socket, and turn on the socket. This is whenever a user joins our chat room, any of the chat rooms that he may declare. Name and room are the variables that we need as the parameters for that function. These are the two parameters that are input by the user. We type in and callback. Callback is used for error message throwing. Say if that function doesn't work, it will call back to the statement that we will write in front of this. And simply use the add user function that we just declared in the users.js file. The ID would be mapped to socket ID, so that is the variable that we would send to the add users function, passing it as a parameter. The name would go just as name, and the room would go just as room, because those don't need to be changed. Since the ID wasn't input by the user, we need to actually declare it by mapping it to a variable and using socket ID as the value for ID when we're passing it to the add user function. Close this up, semicolon. Once we're done with that, actually there's an error over here. I'll just put plus instead of an equal to. Now that error has been resolved. If there is an error, we will use the callback function. So as you remember before, when we were writing our users.js code, we had declared certain errors, like right over here. Look over this. So this would essentially be that if there is an error thrown, it would return the callback function. So the callback function would print the error message itself. In our case, we've mapped the error messages to the error variables that we've declared in users. Simply type an error as the callback parameter, and that will simply display that error if the error is thrown. We write socket.join user. So for that user to be added, we need to implement the socket.join, and we need to emit a message to the chat to welcome that particular user inside the chat room. That would be displayed as the user, that particular person, whoever is greeting that particular user inside the chat room. We'll simply call that as the admin. Text that is attached after that string would be that user's name, so we'll simply access it using $sign and JavaScript curly brace at user.name, and we close this up. So this will fetch the user's name from that particular input, and simply type in the welcome message, which is welcome to the room, and then we will add the room name, whatever has been input by the user. It could be a room that has been created instantly upon request from the user, or it could be a room that is existing beforehand. So either way, simply type in user room, and we actually need to encase that in curly brackets. So round brackets. So once we've done that, we can close this up and broadcast this using socket so that everybody knows that that user has joined. So this is for all of the people that are already existing in the room. That will give them a message that this particular user has joined in the chat room. Emit, and this will also emit a message like before, and the variables that we're passing to the message is actually user admin, which is the person that is giving them that message, although this is just a pre-designated string value. Simply type in text, and the text would contain this particular variable. Type in, open this up with a single quote, has joined the chat room. Now we don't need to add the room name right here because it seems kind of redundant, and we'll close this up. So once we've done that, we can close this up with semicolon. So both of the messages have been printed. Like the broadcast is to broadcast to all of the users present inside the room already to basically declare that a new user has joined the room, and socket.emit is specifically for that user who has just joined the room, because he doesn't need to see that message with the broadcast message. So once that is done, we type in IO. Although if it's a broadcast, then that user will see it as well, but the other users will not be able to see the welcome to the room message because they are not the ones who are joining the room for the first time. So when we type in user.room.emit room data, these variables would make sense when we start dealing with the front end. Room would be mapped to user.room because that's the input, and users would be mapped to get users in room. So this would display all of this function is essentially supposed to return all of the users that are present in the room. We imported this module from users.js, and the parameter that we pass to this is user.room. So obviously we need to pass the room to that function to know all of the participants of that room. Once we've done that, simply end the statement and write the callback function for any errors, although we haven't declared any, but we can still write that function in the case of any errors. It's always good practice to do that. So once we've done with that, we can simply close this up. Next thing that we will be doing is socket.on disconnect. So the disconnect is triggered when a user disconnects from a room. So this would have the remove user function inside of it. If you're following me, if you've gotten the flow of this, simply create a function. This would not require any parameters to be passed inside of it because we would be fetching the socket ID from ourselves, from the server's end only. We don't need any input for that. So we'll simply const user remove socket ID. So the socket ID is fetched by the server itself from the socket IO module. So that is passed as the parameter for remove user function. And the remove user function simply disconnects that particular user from the array that we have created in users.js. So now we're writing if user. So the user variable is essentially storing the value of remove user function. So the remove user function is essentially returning if the operation was successful or not. So if user, that means if the remove user's operation was successful, we'll simply display that message onto the chat room as well. So for that we'll do the same as we did before for socket emit. Simply write io.to user room and .emit message, and the user for this particular message will type in as admin, like before. Simply type in admin. Although this admin is this imaginary character that is hard coded into the server itself, it's not an actual user. But just to display messages, we're typing admin as the user, and the text that would be associated to this would be, we can specify the user that has left. So we'll simply copy this user.name and paste it over here and type in has left the chat room and put an exclamation mark over there just for effect. Close this up. The second would be to update the users in the room, so that the list should get updated, whatever the view of that is. So for other people to see that that user has left the chat room, they would have to see the newer updated list. So before we actually start the server, we need to resolve certain dependencies like socket.io and chorus. So we need to install these packages. Simply type in npm install chorus, press enter. Once that is done, we will install socket.io. Thirdly, we will be installing Express, because that is also a dependency. Simply type npm install Express. So wait for that to be done. Okay, that seems to be done because I had already, I think, installed Express. Now that that is done, we can simply start the server. Simply type npm start. So this will start the server on the port 5000, I believe. So as you can see, the server has started. You can simply type in localhost 5000 and that would open up the server. You can see the response. The server has successfully started, so we can be sure that the server has started. Okay, so now we'll head over to the join component and create our landing page for the website. Whenever the client logs into the website, so we'll open up join and create a new file inside of join, which we'll call join.js. So this is a JavaScript file, and we would be making our landing page inside of this. We're coding our landing page inside of this. First component that we need, the first module that we need actually, is React. So we'll be importing that from the React module, and the second component that we need from the React module is the use state that React provides us. So as we discussed previously in our presentation, if there are a lot of changes required in the states of the components that you would be using within your React application, React provides you with use state to basically implement that. So the package would be React, and close that up. And we also need link from React router. So this would be important for us to redirect the client to various pages. Like say if the client successfully logs into the chat room, the link is what is used to open up the chat room, basically to open up the chat component. So that is why we're using link. So we are importing this from React router. So once we've done that, we'll simply start the code. So firstly, we need to export. We need to create a function that we will call the sign-in function, I believe. So this will be the function that helps the client sign into the chat room. So once we've created that function, we'll create two state variables. Like first one we'll call name. The variable name would be name, and the function associated to it, the state changing function, would be set name. And the default state that we would use for this would be null, because when there's no name provided to us, we'll obviously call it null because the string is empty, and it will be similar for the room. So these are these are basically the two options that the website provides you upon landing onto the joining page. Call this set room, call this use state as well. This would be null as well, not space. We'll also be checking if it's null. As you remembered in the users, I believe it was index.js or users, where we were checking if the string was null, then we weren't actually adding that particular user to any chat room. So here the default state is null. So if the client is giving us an empty input, it wouldn't actually be registered onto the server because we've already made a checking statement for that, made an if statement for that. So both of these values have to be non-null in nature. So then we'll finally create our JSX element. JSX element would contain something like create an outer container for this. So this is all HTML code. I'll simply be coding this according to your needs. You would basically code it. I want my website structure to be something similar to this. We'll create an inner container as well. Just make these into round brackets first. The return statement should begin with the round bracket. Once that is done, we'll begin with the code. We'll start up an H1 tab inside of this. We'll call this title. So this would display what the page is actually all about. It basically is an H1 tag for what the name of the page is. So we'll simply call it join a chat room. I think that's good. So when that's done, let's create another div inside of this. So every time you create a div, you're basically creating a block of element within that particular JSX code. So we also need something for an input box for our particular name, wherever the user would enter their name. So we need an input box for that. So simply just type in input placeholder. So this is basically one of those things where you have an input box, and within this in translucent text you can see something like name or email, and when you start typing your email, that disappears. So that is what a placeholder is. So this placeholder name, and create a class name for this. We're creating class names for this just in case if we decide to use the CSS for this, we will refer to all of these elements by their class names. And it's kind of different from HTML, because in HTML, if you remember, you only use class. But if you're using JSX within React, you specifically need to write class name instead of class. So these are the little differences that are present in between the syntax of JSX and HTML. So join input, and I'll create the rest of the folder structure as well, the rest of the website structure as well. So this is how the JSX structure would look like once you've coded it according to your needs. So in my case, I've created the title as join chat room. So you'll see that title up top, and then we have the two placeholders for the name and room, where the user would input the name, the username that they want to use, and the room that they want to join or create, and they're starting up the chat room. So these are the two input placeholders for that, and we've added on change. So whenever there is an actual input on it, we will say, and the input is actually registered by clicking on the sign in button or the login button in our case. We are setting the name with the new event target value, which would be the name that the user has input in the placeholder. And similarly, the same goes for the room as well. So we're setting the room with that value as well. So these are the two values that would be set in the string values of this particular name and room variable. So after that, we are adding the sign in button, the login button that we have over here. So the button name is login, and we're simply checking first if the room is a non-null value and the name is the non-null value as well. So if you remember correctly, on the server's end, we are only checking if after our removal of white spaces, the trailing white spaces, and our conversion of the entire string into a lowercase string, if the string is null or not, that is what we're checking on the server's end. But on the client's end, we have to check that the string in itself is not null before we actually send it to the server, just to save up on some time. save up on some server resources. Like the client shouldn't be able to send an empty string to the server. That should be checked on the client side itself. That is why we're checking if not name and not room, not name or not room, then we will prevent the default. That means the clicking would not actually incur the action. It would not actually redirect us to the chat room, and it will not actually trigger anything on the server's end as well. So the client would actually have to enter a valid username and room number. So after that has been completed, we'll simply set two variables. We'll call this name and room. This would be attached in the link that we're sending. So we would redirect ourselves to the chat JS. So in the folder structure, we have chat question mark, and the two parameters that we're passing to chat are name and room. So those are the two things. So once that has been done, we'll simply create our button for the sign in, which we're calling login, and then we'll end the link. So this link is a part of React Rotterdam. So this actually helps us redirect from one component to the other component. So that's what it's used for. So with that done, we are done with the join JS page. So now that this is done, we will now go to the chat page. So we'll open up a new file inside the chat folder. We'll call it chat.js. Simply close up login after we've saved this. Login, the join page has been saved, the login page has been saved. Now go on to the chat page. Now this will be the page. This will be basically the component page that the client would be redirected to once the client is successfully able to log in. So we'll first start this by importing React. We also need the use state and use effect in this, since we'll be using effects, the React effects in this as well. React. Also need query string for this. Also need the IO from socket IO client. So the one that we used on the server end was the socket IO, but there's also a module for the socket IO on the client end as well. We call that socket IO client. So once we imported all of that, we also need to import certain components that we haven't yet created. We'll call this, actually we'll just create them and then we'll implement this. So firstly we'll just create the components for chat. So we'll declare the socket variable and we'll start up the chat function. So whenever this function is called, the chat component would be initiated. The parameter that would be passed to it would be the location. Now we'll also discuss about the location variable in a bit. So we need to create certain state variables for this particular component, like name. So we'll create them set name and simply type in the same for the other variables that you may need. Set room and simply declare it with null as the default. Similarly, we'll do this for other variables as well. If we want to know all of the users in a particular chat room, we're using the users variable for that. The message that we would want to type into the message box, so that would be stored in message. This would also be null by default, so we have to check if we're not sending empty messages. And finally, the array of messages that is already present in the message box, we'll call this messages. So this would be the log of the messages that is already present in the chat box. We'll call this set messages. This would actually be an array, so not a string array. We'll actually declare it with an array. And then we need to declare our endpoint. So this would be basically where we would be redirected to. where the chat application is actually hosted. So in our case, we'll simply use localhost 5000. So this is the actual endpoint that we're trying to access, server location, which is localhost 5000 in our case. And once that's done, we close that up. So all of these variables have been declared. Now we start with the process of actually connecting our endpoints, as in we are connecting the front end to the back end. So we'll use an use effect for that. So this would be essentially sending the variables that are input by the client on the client end, like the name and room, and we'll send it to the server backend. For that, we'll simply create a function. So once we've created a function, we'll simply type in name and room, because these are the two variables that we have to send to the server. And we'll simply get the query string for this. So we'll now create a socket for our endpoint. Simply call this endpoint because that is a variable which stores our localhost 5000 value. We'll set the room for this, as in we'll change the default variable, the default value of the variable to whatever the user has input. So this would be sent to the chat component by the join component or the server itself. So the flow that would be followed is first the join component would send certain details to the server, and the server would give those details to the front end again after the join has redirected essentially to the chat. So all of these things would be retrieved from the server. Socket.emit. So we now need to connect to the function that the server houses, which is join. In our case, whenever a new user is trying to join, or an old user as well. So these are the two values that we were passing to that particular function, which were name and room. Also adding error for whenever if there is an error that is given to the server. And this would be given as an alert to the client, because the error would be sent back, it would be called back to the client side, and we could simply print whatever the error is, because the server isn't actually printing the error, the server is just sending the error message. So if the value of error is not null, as if there is an error, simply bring up an alert for that error. So an alert is basically, if you use Google Chrome, it is like a pop-up window that appears in the top of your screen telling you that there's an error. So this is an element that you can use in JavaScript React. So once that is done, simply pass on the point search. Now we'll create the connect function for sending a particular message. Now that we've created the joining function, the room joining function. Now we'll create a function for message sending. Turn on the socket for a particular message. So this would access the message function present inside the server. As you remember from before, in the index.js file in our server, we had functions like join message, set the stage of the message, set the state of the message, and this would essentially pick up all the messages that are present in the messages, using it as an array. Once we've done that, we also need the room data. If we wanted to get all of the users present inside a particular room, we'll simply type in socket.on room data. Set the users. We'll set it with the array of whatever the user names are, and then we'll close this. So once that is done, simply type in the function for sending a message, start that event, So we also need to ensure right over here that the message is not null. So we'll use a prevent default for that, so that the message is not actually sent if the message is null. So if the value of message is a non-null value, then only we will socket emit it to the server. So we'll call the server function, which is send message, and pass in as the parameter the message that we're trying to send, setting the message state to null, so that after we've sent the message, we can't have that same value in our text box, right? We need to remove it from the text box. Like whenever you are texting somebody, the moment you send the message, the text from your text box disappears, so that you can type a new message or wait for the recipient to reply. So we need to set it to null so that it's back to its original state, and then we simply close this up. After that, we'll simply create the visual element for this, the JSX element for this. So I'll type in the code. So my finished JSX code for chat.js looks something like this. So we've created two divisions in this. One is outer container, the second is inner container, which actually houses our text box, where we'll be texting the chat window basically. And we are basically writing down, like, we've implemented three functions inside of this. And these three functions we would actually be importing from various JavaScript files that we would be creating. The first is info bar, the second is messages. So this would basically display all of the messages that are present inside of that chat box that have been already written down. The third is input, which is the actual element where we would be inputting the message that we are trying to write, and we are passing parameters alongside these functions. Like for info bar, we're passing the room. So the info bar, the task of the info bar is to display the room number or the room name in which we are chatting. The task of messages is to display all of the messages that have been there before, and the task of input function is to basically register the input for this. So we're presenting the first value as first parameter for this as message, so the message that we've immediately typed. Then we're actually changing the state of the message, so we're sending the state value for that as well, and we're using the function send message. So now we'll create two more JavaScript files. The first would be called messages.js. Firstly, we'll click on this particular link on the messages folder, and we'll create the new JavaScript file called messages.js. Close these up, save them, of course, we'll close them up. Once you've created the messages.js, we'll open up the message folder and we'll create another file within the message folder. Actually, firstly, call this message.js. So, actually, I added a comma over there. Let's remove that. So firstly, we would be writing the code for messages.js now that we fixed up the folder structure. So we'll import React for this. And then we'll import something called scroll to bottom. So as you know, in the text services that you use, like Facebook chatting or WhatsApp chatting, so you might have noticed that whenever the messages are the screen is filled with messages, essentially the screen scrolls to the bottom of the latest message that there exists. So that is also functionality that React offers. So we'll simply import this from React scroll to bottom. So if there isn't, there are some dependencies that haven't been resolved. We'll simply resolve them when we deploy it on the client side, and then we'll import message from message folder within message. So this is actually the subdirectory that we've created inside the messages folder, which we are calling message. So that is the another JavaScript file that we have, which we'll code in a while. So once that is done, we'll simply type in the function for this. So two parameters that we need to pass. First is the actual messages, so that we can see all the messages that are present on the screen. Second is the name. So create a function for this. Use the scroll to bottom function that we've imported from React scroll to bottom, and we create a map with a variable I. I'll tell you what this variable I is in a second. The function would have put a comma over here, which we need to remove, and we'll simply type in a values for this. So we've done that. We can now send in the actual message parameter by using the message function that we've imported. So we'll call this. So the code would look something like this after you've done it, writing it. So basically scrolling to the bottom, every time the message window is getting filled up with messages, so that the newer messages are shown at the absolute bottom. And we're calling the message function, passing the two values, message and name, to this, so that the message is the subcomponent of the messages function is able to show all of those messages in a proper bubble format. So now we'll code for the message JavaScript component. So after you finish writing the JSX code, it will look something like this, depending on how you've written it. In my case, I'm checking first if the current message is sent by the current user, and if that message is sent by the current user, we're simply putting it on the right side by using send text PR10. So PR stands for it will be 10 pixels from the right of that particular subcomponent that we're writing this code into, and we're then writing the username for that particular user, whichever the client is in the case of the message being sent by the current client. Then we're changing the background color of that message box to blue. So if you're the person who has sent that particular message, your message would appear in blue, just like in Facebook chat. But no, if not, the message would appear on the left hand side, because we're using PL10. So it stands for left, L stands for left, and it's 10 pixels from the left. In that case, that particular user would appear, whichever user is actually is the author of that particular message, and that message would appear in a background light color. The bubble would appear in a background light color. So just like in the Facebook chat, your messages appear in blue color, while your recipient's messages appear in a light grayish color. So that is what would be implemented here. So once we're done with that, we'll simply export the message function, which we've declared over here with all of these, and we'll get on to writing the info bar. Also, all of these class names would be mapped to a particular CSS value. So we haven't created CSS files for this yet, but we're creating separate names for separate CSS elements, so that if the message box is background light, we can create an element for this particular class name and declare the background as light, while for this we can declare the background as blue. So all of this would be implemented from a visual perspective when we actually write the message.css file and we import it into the message. So that can be done later on after the base code has been written. So we'll now write the code for the info bar. The info bar basically contains which room we are chatting within. Like if you're chatting in a group chat, you would know the group chat's name on the top. So that little bluish bar that you have in your Facebook Messenger at the top, which declares the room name, we're simply implementing that as well. So we'll simply import React for this first. Should be a rather small code. React. That should be about it for the imports. We'll create a function info bar for info bar.js. Parameters that we would pass to this would solely be the room, because we only need the room name, and then we can begin with the function. So this would only have to return two divisions, I believe. Firstly, we'll create another division which we'll call class name bar. So this would we can implement the design for this using the CSS style file. Once that is done, we can close this up and start with another division, which we'll call class name left inner. We'll close this up, and within this we'll create an, I think, h3. You can create an h2 as well. I think an h3 would be enough size, and we'll simply create a JavaScript curly bracket opening and write in room. So the h3 would contain the room name that has been passed to the info bar value, and then we'll simply export this function having export default info bar, and we close this up and save it. The last thing we need to implement before we head on over to our app.js and index.js, the code modifications we need to do in those JavaScript files before we can actually deploy this on the client side. We need to create our input.js and couple all of these JavaScript components together, because we haven't coupled them together. So it's essential for us to couple them together before we can get some sort of a structure going. So for input.js as well, we'll import React. We don't need to actually import any of the elements in this. We'll simply start with our function straight away. So this is the actual component that helps us send a particular message to the server, because we in the previous function for our chat.js, I think we sent this particular parameter send message function as a parameter in that function. So that's what we're implementing right over here. I think if you check our chat.js, we're actually sending the send message right over here as a parameter. So this function is actually sent as a parameter. So that is what we can implement in our function right here. Create a form. We want this class form, and then we're using the input function for this. Simply write in the class name as input. Write any class name you want. The type for this particular input is text. It's not password, it's text. And the placeholder for this, type your message, and we'll add like 3 dots. This is what the placeholder text looks like for when you actually are typing a message. The value that this particular input would contain is the actual message that is stored in that text box. So this has been passed as a parameter as well to input by our chat.js JavaScript file. Change, we will simply make that placeholder contain that value which is contained instead of the placeholder as the target for our input. And we will set the message value, as we had passed the set message state variable as well to our input JS file. I will simply set it as the value that is present within the text box, and we send our messages using the enter key. So we'll also add an on key press parameter to this, so that we don't necessarily have to click. We can also just press enter and the message will be sent. Event, that message would be sent. The trigger would be there. The function trigger would be there. So the function that would be availed by this is send message, and the event is already there. So send that. If enter is not pressed, so nothing would be sent. No function would be executed. Simply register that as null, and we close this up. So now that it's closed up, we can also create a button to send our messages, not just by using enter. Something that we can click as well. So we'll call this the send button, and simply whenever you're using this, you can simply write on click variable, any variable, dummy variable we can create, and map it to send message e. So this e would be the actual message that is contained in there, and we'll call this button zap. Or we can call this send message, depending on what you want. Yes. So this would be the button which actually sends the message. And then we'll close this up. So once you've corrected the format and everything, and then you will simply export this function so that it's accessible by other components of your React.JS file structure. So now we can move on to coupling all of these values, all of these components actually. So here we have our chat.js file, which is the primary driver function, the driver component for all of these sub-components. So we've also imported these particular JavaScript files that we had created before, like the info bar, the input, and the messages. And within messages, you can also see that within messages, I've also imported the sub component of messages, which was message from .message. So all of these directories have been particularly imported. Now, since these have been coupled, we can move on to coding our main components, which are the app.js and the index.js, the rendering components, so to speak, for our client side, so that things will appear in the first place. So we'll head on towards that. So head over to your app.js. So after you've opened up your app.js, simply remove everything that is except for your import React statement, because we would be needing that. So once you've done that, simply couple your previous elements like your chat from dot components slash chat. So this would be the first element, and second element that you will need is join, because that is the first landing page that appears. So these have already been created. We've created all of these components. Now we can use them as many times as we want, as we had discussed in our presentation. That is the primary benefit of using React. So we've done that. Now we'll import browser router so that we can route depending on the user action. So we'll import browser router as router and route this from React router. So wherever we have to use browser router, we'll simply write router. You can read up on the React router DOM documentation a little more in clarity to understand how it works. But for now, you can understand it as something that redirects us to different components present within your web application. Return a statement for this particular app.js. We'll simply use router. And this is basically, we can write browser router instead of this, but since we've imported browser router as router, we can simply write router. So that reduces the time to write, although if you want to write browser router, you can do that as well. And the paths, first path to the join, which is the exact component, which would mean that it is the first page that the user lands to. Second router path would be the route path actually, and this would be the slash chat. So if the person ever inputs into the URL slash chat, they would be redirected to this component, which is chat. So also discuss where this was actually implemented in our code. Now that we've done that, we'll simply export default app. So that would be about it for the app.js. Close this up. I think that is fine. So yeah, we have route paths slash chat over here. So if you remember correctly, if I just open up my chat.js, I believe, no, actually not chat.js, join.js, we have something like the link that it has been redirected to is slash chat question mark name and the name variable in JavaScript, room, the room variable in JavaScript. So this is basically what you see when you type in a particular request to a website. This is the actual format that is actually implemented. So when there is slash chat question mark, we are basically routing that particular value, this chat question mark, this chat essentially, to our chat component. So that is what the router is doing. It's basically taking up a component and it's routing it to a component that we've declared, taking up a name in the URL and routing it to a component. Like if the path is slash chat, it will route to this particular component. If the path is default, as in if the person just enters the localhost 3000 wherever the port we want to launch our client side is, it'll simply, the exact component that it would route to is the join, which is the first landing page for our website. So these are the two essential components that we need, which contain all the sub components that would constitute for our client side chat application. So now that that is done, we can move on to editing our index.js. So we've opened up our index.js file. So the first thing we would do is remove all of this except for our React and maybe our React DOM. So we don't need all of that, the things that are available other than that. So simply import your app from your dot app. I think that is the directory here. So once you've done that, you can simply render your React page. So we use React DOM render for that. Simply type in app, the name of the function that you're using, that you're basically rendering, and document get element by ID, and we'll put this as root. So that would correlate to the public HTML that we have for this, which is the HTML that would actually render all of these components of React. That is one of the key points, the key advantages of React. It's at the end of it, it's rendered as an HTML, but you can do all of these logic-based things with it using JavaScript. So that is how we implement logic in the front end using React.js. So once that is done, we're pretty much about done. Save that. Now the next thing we need to do is add a certain number of dependencies. To resolve those dependencies, we need to install certain packages. So we'll first install npm install query string. So because we're using query string, so we need to install it in our modules. We'll do that. So once that is done, we can CLS first, and then we can install npm install actually our React DOM if it's not actually installed. React DOM is actually installed. If you are creating a boilerplate React code, you can, that's already installed, so you don't need to worry about that. The next dependency that we will check for is React router DOM. So clear the screen, and now we will add React scroll to bottom by writing npm install React scroll to bottom. Okay, so once we've added that, we can add the socket.io client and simply type npm install socket.io client. That will install our socket.io client side modules. So all of these things are done. So all of our dependencies essentially are resolved. Now we can go on to implement the deployment of the client side code. Now that our code logic has been implemented, we'll simply add in the style files for this, the CSS files, so that things would actually appear on screen in a much more organized and structured format. Because if we start our front end right now by simply typing npm start, it does not actually show anything because a lot of elements aren't being able to render because we haven't implemented the style files yet. So we'll do that. As we can see now, we have added CSS files for all of the components. You can make these CSS files on your own, basically to give some structure and design to these particular components that you have, and simply type in import and the address of that particular CSS in the import statements, and then all of these class names would be referred to that particular CS, and then you can basically implement all of the CS styles. So now we will start our server by typing npm start. So it will open up to something like this. We have our join chat room landing page right here. So this is the first page that will open. If you open the default localhost 3000 that is set for the client side, and now we will type in something like Intellipaat as the username, and the number or the room name would be 1. Once we log in, we're inside room 1. Simply type in localhost 3000 again, open another instance, and we can create another user called the Intellipaat 2 and room number 1, so they will join in the same room again. So when the first person, we switch back to the first instance, so we'll see Intellipaat 2 has joined. So we'll simply type in hello from Intellipaat 1. It will display over here, and when we go here, we have these messages. So the admin, which we had hard coded into the chat box, it says Intellipaat 1, and that person, the other user. So, and we can similarly create a user. Right, simply typing localhost 3000 and call this Intellipaat 3 and room 1. So the room has to be the same. We can actually try Intellipaat 2 so that we get that error message because Intellipaat 2 already exists. We'll simply click on login and it says username is taken. We get that alert. We cannot actually log in. So we're not actually in that chat room. So we'll go back again and we'll type in something different. 3000, we'll type Intellipaat 3 and 1. Now we're able to log in. Type in hello. We're able to see it from here that Intellipaat 3 has typed hello. We're able to see it from here. Intellipaat 3 has typed hello. Similarly, we can add as many users as we want, and we can make this website live as well to implement it on the grand scale. So that was about it from our side. Hope you enjoyed this React.JS tutorial session. You can obviously experiment with the CSS on your own. You can add new elements to it. You can implement a lot of new functionalities with the components that you have. The main point of using React.JS is that it makes your job simpler by providing you with reusability and code modularity in a way that makes your code really, really organized. So you can easily transition to full stack as well after you've learned React. To know more about the courses that we provide, you can contact us using the following course details. Thank you for attending the session once again. See you again in the next session.